Hello everyone and welcome to Very Cold Lasagna. I am your host, Dylan Lasagna, and this is episode number 270 of this icy yet spicy podcast for all your filthy casual takes on the world of sports for you casual fans out there like you and me. And in this episode of the pod, we're going to go back into the coldest depths of the freezer, grab that old icebox, and we're not going to do a retro review for this old icebox episode. We're actually, I haven't done this in a pretty long time. We're actually going to be doing a retrospective on a specific historical event. Rather, actually, a little bit of chain of events that happened on a specific year, on a specific time of year, 20 years ago. So what exactly is that chain of events? Well, it is kind of draft season after all. Well, not really, because the NFL draft was over like a couple weeks ago. But there still have been rumblings about another kind of draft, that being the WWE Draft. It's slated to happen any day now in the year of 2025, but 20 years ago, there was a more important draft, that being the WWE Draft Lottery. So here in this episode, we're going to be talking about the historic, the very important 2005 WWE Draft Lottery and just how important, just how significant that draft lottery was 20 years ago and how still important it was 20 years later. So we're going to be talking about it from the filthy casual fan perspective, that being me, and, well, how you can look at it from your perspective. So before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping. Make sure you follow Very Cold Lasagna on social media. My socials are always in the links on both audio and on my YouTube channel. And if you're listening to all on Very Cold Lasagna on audio, make sure you rate and review the show wherever you get your podcast, whether it be on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you smash the like button, smash the subscribe button. And if you're not subscribed already, what the heck are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. And yeah, so you'll be notified of each and every episode, video that's are exclusive to YouTube. That don't get posted on audio platforms, all the good extra stuff that's only exclusive to YouTube. Leave a comment down below on the topic at hand for whether it's an episode or a little extra that I post on here on YouTube. And the topic at hand being the 2005 WWE Draft Lottery. And as always, share this with your friend, share this with your neighbor, share this with whoever's around you, whether it's at work or school. Share the good, the bad, the ugly about this filthy casual podcast entitled Very Cold Lasagna. So let's talk about the topic at hand today that's in the coldest depths of the freezer, that's inside the old icebox, and that is the 2005 WWE Draft Lottery. Now, prior to this draft lottery, WWE has held just two WWE drafts before this. The very first one in 2002 and the previous year in 2004. 2004 wasn't as important and wasn't as groundbreaking as the first one in 2002. Backtracking here, by the way. So the first one in 2002, just to sum it all up, I felt it was important for the WWE at the time because by the end of the invasion angle, I talked about that in one of my very first retrospectives here on the podcast, like when I first started out. But to sum it up, the WWE roster at the time in 2000, by the end of 2001, going into 2002, it was super bloated. It was super bloated with talent, super bloated with too many wrestlers on one roster that Vince McMahon felt the need to split it up into two entities and two rosters. I mean, realistically, he could because he had two shows on hand, that being Monday Night Raw and Smackdown at the time, and still is to this day. So they had the brand extension, that being AKA the first original brand split. So they did the draft in 2002 originally, and then they brought back the draft 2 years later, albeit in a slightly different format, that being the draft lottery, where you had a little turnstile, and that was to be drawn by both general managers of Raw and Smackdown. And I say the 2004 draft lottery it wasn't really as important. It wasn't really as significant as the one in 2002 and the one I'll get into in this episode. And I'll give my reasons why. I'll give my reasons why 2004 wasn't as important as either 2002 or 2004 later on when we get to that point. So now that we talked about a little bit, touched on both the 2002 and the 2004 WWE drafts prior to this one, we can now shift gears to the 2005 WWE Draft Lottery. So we're now at the point post WrestleMania 21, and now it's time to start thinking about what's next. What's next for the WWE post WrestleMania 21? We established 2 new world champions in Batista and John Cena, and pretty much, as I mentioned in my WrestleMania retro review of WrestleMania 21, basically establishing 2 new faces of the company, but there are also some other storylines that, for the most part, either wrapped up or continuing along. Well, the answer to that question was, 2 weeks after WrestleMania, on an episode of Monday Night Raw, WWE Chairman Vince McMahon announced another draft lottery. Following the success, well, at least how Vince McMahon said it, following the success of the one from the year prior, in order to, quote unquote, shake things up again, pal. Yeah, so Vince McMahon announced another draft lottery that was going to take place. And just like the year prior, there would be no exceptions. No exceptions on who was going to get drafted, whether it was to Raw or to Smackdown. So, yeah, that included champions, injured wrestlers, even the announcers, even the commentators, and just like the year prior, even general managers. So pretty much everybody that you could name. Heck, even the timekeeper, even the timekeeper on both shows. Everyone was eligible to be drafted to either show at a time. So, yeah, there were no exceptions to the rule for this draft lottery. And honestly, I like that. I really like that with the draft back in the day. And I don't like it how they do it now, where champions were exempt from being drafted. It lessens the suspense. It lessens the suspense. And to be honest with you, I know they're trying to they are copying the NFL and NBA draft, but not really, because by not drafting, by keeping the champions exempt, it's like, again, like, what's the point? What's the point of keeping your champions on one show every year? It doesn't make sense to me. So another rule that was in place for this draft lottery was trades. Trades could take place a couple hours after the draft by the show's GMs. They were allowed to trade anyone on the roster before midnight after the end of the draft. So they only had a couple of hours after the end of the draft to make any trades that they wanted. They did this the year prior in 2004 as well, although nothing significant came out of it. So, yeah, they were allowed to do that as well. Just wanted to make that noted. So, the draft is often needed to hit that reset button for the WWE, like it was the year before, in 2002, and obviously the years following 2005. So, yeah, the draft, I feel like, in my opinion, even if it's not well executed in modern times, I still feel like it's a reset button for the WWE to try and, quote unquote, shake things up again, especially during post WrestleMania times. And this one was no exception in 2005, because many of WWE's feuds that started at the height of Mania 21 season, like, they continued, especially the major ones that we're going to talk about. And they really need to wrap up to prevent burnout, to prevent fatigue from the fans. So this draft lottery that Vince McMahon announced just 2 weeks after WrestleMania, it really needs to deliver in contrast to the year prior. Like, it really needs to hit home, because they've done 2 of these and only one, and it was only like a 50%. It was only a 50% ratio. Again, they only had 2, and only one of them like so far has succeeded. But Vince McMahon really needs to hit the hammer home on this draft. So I mean, again, it's still predetermined, but you want to make the viewers that don't pay attention to speculation and all that stuff, even if it was like pre-social media, you want to make them surprised in the very least. So the lead up to this draft, the draft itself wasn't mentioned much since the initial announcement, outside of passing mentions mostly on Raw, because like I said, WWE was still trying to either wrap up some of its storylines before pre-WrestleMania, or it was progressing its key storylines that continued after WrestleMania, when they were doing their brand exclusive pay-per-views like Judgment Day and Vengeance, that were going along post WrestleMania. So they were still doing only a select few of their key storylines, but it wasn't until 3 weeks prior that the draft lottery became a major talking point again, in a segment with Randy Orton, who was on the sidelines injured and hadn't been seen since the Raw after Mania 21 because of a shoulder injury, and he had to get surgery, and he declared himself ineligible to be drafted. But once again, Vince McMahon reiterated that he still was draft eligible, regardless if he was injured or not. So it was another segment where Vince basically made people aware of the draft rules, and he revealed a date. He revealed the date of June 6, 2005 for the start of this draft lottery. And it ended up being a month-long process. Where it heightened the suspension of which wrestler was going to go to what show. And there was also another segment with Christian cutting a promo, teasing a future feud with SmackDown's WWE champion John Cena should Christian go to SmackDown and Cena stayed there. And who knows? Maybe it teased the seeds for a certain pay-per-view later that month, next month. So yeah, other than that, that's pretty much it. Not even SmackDown had any, not very little to no passing mentions about the WWE draft itself. So, but it was mainly all the passing mentions were on Raw, because again, the draft didn't really have a lot of focus because of key storylines having to wrap up, having to progress on their brand specific pay-per-views, and there's another storyline that was ongoing. And we'll talk about that in just a bit. So then we get to the start of the draft lottery, which began on June 6, 2005. It officially kicked off on that episode of Raw. Yes, that famous episode of Raw on June 6 in St. Louis, Missouri, which, by the way, it happened to be the site of the most recent Backlash. So just a little factoid there. And Chris Jericho, he was set to announce the first overall pick on his little talk show, The Highlight Reel. So Jericho and the WWE wasted no time, because the anticipation in the Enterprise Center, or whatever the arena was called at the time, I think it was the Joe Louis Arena. Yeah, but either way, the St. Louis crowd didn't want to wait anymore. So WWE and Jericho, they got straight to the point. They wanted to see who's going to come out to that curtain and see who is going to be that number 1 overall draft pick that was going to come over to Raw. And to the absolute shock of everybody in St. Louis, to the absolute shock of Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler, and to the big smile on Chris Jericho's face and his own shock, out came SmackDown's WWE champion, John Cena. John Cena walked through the curtain to an amazing loud standing ovation. And wow. And even though I didn't watch, even though I didn't start watching wrestling until several months later, I understood how important this moment was. Just how important of a moment. This was a significant game-changing moment for the WWE. and not just a game-changing moment, but it was a tone setter for both the draft and the years to come for WWE. And man, having watched that moment, of course, months later, when I first started watching wrestling, it's like you felt the excitement, you felt the surprise, you felt the shock, like you felt all so many things that nobody thought that John Cena was gonna get drafted. He's gonna move over from SmackDown to the A show, Raw. It's like, wow, like Cena. It put Cena on a really high pedestal at the time. It was like that was a really big deal at the time. And well, of course, we'll get into why that was such a big deal at the time, because we're going to get into all the other big moves that happened in this draft. So the draft shifted over to SmackDown later that week. The Blue Brand left without a world champion, obviously, because Cena was now on Raw, and that left to general manager Teddy Long having to create what was called at the time the quote-unquote SmackDown Championship, which would be introduced at the end of June via a six-pack elimination challenge match. So, yeah, they had to introduce a brand new world championship, which I said is the SmackDown Championship. And when it came to the actual draft pick itself for SmackDown, the first pick and the second overall draft pick in this draft lottery, it was the return of the Rabid Wolverine, the Invisible Man, Chris Benoit, to the Blue Brand. And he hasn't been there since, well, last year when he moved over to Raw because he won the Royal Rumble, and he decided to use that clause to challenge for the World Heavyweight Championship. So Benoit, after a 1-year absence from the Blue Brand, he made his return in the draft. And while it wasn't as major of a move as Cena was, obviously, but it was a needed one. It was a needed one for the depth for SmackDown. And when I mean depth, I mean, adding layers to the roster on SmackDown. So we move on to the rest of the weeks for the draft. So week 2, it was also another seismic shift on both shows. Kurt Angle, the Olympic gold medalist, moved over to Raw, and what was a very sweaty segment. And from what I've seen and from what I read, the AC was not working in that arena where they were at. That was made for some very interesting segments, especially in the opening segment with Kurt Angle. Everyone was just taking off their suits, and they were just sweating to the brim. And then Kurt Angle had a woo off with Ric Flair, and Triple H was accusing Kurt Angle of gimmick infringement. And yeah, they had the whole funny segment in Kurt Angle's first night back on Raw. But probably the biggest talking point of week 2 of that draft was Randy Orton, the Legend Killer, moving over to SmackDown and making an immediate impact to continue his feud with The Undertaker. So Undertaker was costed a match by Randy Orton, and Randy Orton revealed that he was the next draft pick for SmackDown, while also revealing he was now fully healthy and cleared to compete. So that set the tone for their feud continuing. Now, week 3 didn't have as much significance, at least in terms of star power, of the first 2 weeks, but it did see some interesting developments, at least on the Raw side, because Carlito was the next draft pick for Raw, and he immediately stole the Intercontinental Championship from Shelton Benjamin. So, yeah, right out of the gates, Carlito, who was on the up and up in the mid-card, on his first night on Raw, he won the Intercontinental title. Interesting, to say the least. Meanwhile, you had Muhammad Hassan with that rather controversial gimmick, and I say he played it well. He moved over to SmackDown, and he was inserted into the 6-pack elimination match for that new SmackDown title, and he got a big win over the Big Show with some help from Matt Morgan. So then we get to the final week of this draft lottery, and speaking of the Big Show and Rob Van Dam got drafted over to Raw. Rob Van Dam, by the way, he was actually recovering from a torn ACL at the time. But again, goes back to the point of anyone that was injured still was eligible to be drafted. Meanwhile, the draft itself ended with a bang. And what do I mean by bang bang? Well, Christian moved over to SmackDown, and probably one of the other biggest moves to cap off this draft, the World Heavyweight Champion, Batista, moved over to the blue brand, and essentially swapping both world champions. John Cena moved over to Raw, while Batista, the World Heavyweight Champion, moved over to SmackDown. And man, oh man, like those two moves pretty much changed the game, changed the landscape of the WWE as we knew it in 2005 and for the next several years. Like, oh boy. And like I said, the lead up to the draft lottery, not much to speak of, and they didn't really hype this up. And like, I guess maybe it's for a reason. It's for a reason to maybe build up some anticipation and to make sure not to overhype it. And yeah, I guess it makes a little sense now, in my opinion. And it makes a little sense because Vince McMahon really wanted to be careful, not to like overplay it. Unlike several years later where he just kept bringing up the draft every single week. But also, aside from the fact that focus was placed on the brand exclusive pay-per-views, like Judgment Day and Vengeance, and just wrapping up those storylines that continued past WrestleMania. And then in between all that, you had a storyline involving both Raw and SmackDown wrestlers, which they were all led by Raw General Manager Eric Bischoff. They were all plotting to invade ECW One Night Stand, which was the reunion show for the ECW wrestling promotion, which was created by Paul Heyman back during the height of the 1990s. So, yeah, they had that reunion show in between both Judgment Day and Vengeance, and obviously in the lead up to the draft. So they're focusing their eggs on a couple things besides the WWE draft itself. And also on top of that, Raw and SmackDown also had new developing stories like Edge and Lita's real life affair turned storyline. And then you had Rey Mysterio versus Eddie Guerrero that also was brewing going into this draft. And of course, like I mentioned, like multiple times, they are trying to wrap up the two major storylines that began at going into WrestleMania and continued past WrestleMania. That being Cena versus JBL for the WWE title, and Batista versus Triple H for the World Heavyweight title. So WWE had to be very careful. They had to be very careful not to draft anyone that was gonna effectively wipe away, effectively scrap like any major storylines that either were just beginning or really need to wrap up, like, you know, ASAP. So yeah, not really a lot of draft buildup going into the draft itself, but once it started, in my opinion, it changed completely. That notion of, this doesn't really feel like a draft lottery. It's just gonna feel like last year. But boy, when it started, when I look back at that draft, that changed completely. And again, this is coming from someone that didn't start watching wrestling until like several months at the beginning of 2006. I started at the beginning of 2006, and then I went back and watched what happened several months prior to me first watching. This draft changed completely. Like the notion of this draft and how people were feeling about it, yeah, it changed completely once it actually began. Starting with John Cena moving over to Raw, and probably, I'd say in my opinion, the biggest move in I don't even know what the word is. I'd say the biggest move that the WWE has ever done in terms of the WWE draft since doing the WWE draft. It was like a complete shocker at the time. it was a complete shocker for any kind of wrestling fan, whether you're a casual, a hardcore, diehard, you name it. Like, nobody expected this move. Like, Cena had been on Smackdown for how many years? Since his debut in 2002. But he's running out of things to do. He faced pretty much everyone at that point. And yeah, it was moving over to Raw was a much needed move to avoid complacency for him. Because like I said, he pretty much done everything on SmackDown. And the weeks after Judgment Day were just him biding time, I guess. Him biding time and not really doing anything major until this draft. So yeah, Cena's move to Raw set the tone from there. And while the moves afterward, again, may not have been sexy, besides the last one with Batista, most of them were still essential because they strengthened the mid card for both brands at the time. And look at the couple select list of names that went on to have success following the draft. Like Chris Benoit, for example, he wound up being the United States champion 2 months afterwards at SummerSlam, and he had this lengthy feud with Booker T for the title afterwards. And like I said, with Carlito, he immediately won the Intercontinental Championship on his first night being drafted, and even retained it a couple nights later at Vengeance over Shelton Benjamin. And before he went on to feud with Ric Flair, the Nature Boy, right after Vengeance. And then, even though he started out as, just as a utility bit player, The Big Show formed in my opinion, an underrated tag team. I know some people say, "Oh, really? The Big Show, Big Show, and I'm gonna say it, Big Show and Kane. Really, that's your underrated tag team?" Yes, it is. Yes, it is in my opinion, because look at that duo, man. Look at that duo that won the World Tag Team titles, completely dominated the tag team title scene on Raw, and they were featured pieces in a prominent Survivor Series story that I'm going to talk about that year. Unfortunately, not everyone was lucky, though. Especially the most unfortunate person after the draft was Muhammad Hassan, because a week after the draft, Muhammad Hassan, and I guess to a degree the WWE, they were the victims of bad timing with a controversial angle that was taped 3 days prior to the 2005 London bombings. And that segment that WWE taped with Muhammad Hassan, which was a Tuesday, yeah, and they released it. Were they on Fridays at that point? No, yeah, it was they released it on Friday, but yeah, the London bombings happened, and yeah, they were facing a lot of scrutiny for that segment airing, and the UPN network at the time, yeah, they were threatening to cancel SmackDown, and they really wanted Muhammad Hassan off that show, and it forced WWE's hand, and yeah, that eventually led to Muhammad Hassan being released 2 months later. That sucked, man. That really sucked, because there were a lot of speculation, and I believe Muhammad Hassan said himself that he was supposed to dethrone Batista at SummerSlam, and I believe he had all the tools to be a main event top level heel, like based on that gimmick. But it's just bad timing with Muhammad Hassan. Christian was also an unfortunate victim because he reached his ceiling at the time, even though he was doing really good heel work, but Vince just didn't see him as anything else, unfortunately. So he left in November, letting his contract expire, and he moved over to TNA shortly afterwards, and he had much better success over there up until 2008, before he left to go back to WWE. And then you also had half of the people in the post-draft trades that were released at some point that year. And yeah, they also got released. But of course, the biggest takeaway from this draft, for both the draft and WWE going forward, was the swap of Cena to Raw and Batista to SmackDown. Obviously, that's the biggest highlight of this draft. Those two moves changed the entire landscape of WWE forever, with both not only those two getting a fresh change in scenery, but also further solidifying them as Vince's next franchise faces for the WWE for the next several years. I feel like, in my opinion, though, obvious, and probably everyone else's opinion, Oh, for most people, I wouldn't say everyone because that's too general. In some people's cases, at least John Cena got the better end of the stick. Because I do think Batista had a successful career. He's still very popular with the fans. Cena, though, he had, I'd say, the following factors that Vince ended up feeling Cena was more trustworthy with them. He had a wider variety of fan appeal, so he was appealing to families, kids, women, a select number of adults that were actually into him, despite the amount of detractors that were growing by the numbers very quickly after he got drafted to Raw, and had only grown since. He also had a Platinum Award-winning debut album, and his debut movie, The Marine, was a solid success. And again, he was more reliable because he was able to stay healthy and, for the most part, injury-free for the following 2 years. And in contrast to Batista, unfortunately, where he suffered a torn bicep several months after he got drafted to Smackdown, which derailed some of his momentum at the start of 2006. Now, again, it's not to say that Batista had a very successful career, because he did. But yeah, unfortunately, when he got back in July 2006, and I'd say slowly but surely, I wouldn't say right away, I'd say slowly but surely, he wasn't seen as that 1B to seen as 1A when he got back. And again, slowly but surely, because even after he won the World Heavyweight title from Booker T at Survivor Series in 2006, he eventually ran into bigger names that were getting red hot in the main event scene, like Undertaker, Edge, and as unfortunate of a name that was at the time, the Great Khali. And then once he was done with that, by the end of 2007, he was slightly moving down the card, because he had side feuds with Umaga, Shawn Michaels, CM Punk, you name it. And then it was also from 2007 until the end of his first run where he started becoming a little more injury prone. And that was also when he also had 2 transitional world title runs, and getting ridden off TV twice in 7 months in 2008 to 2009. So Batista eventually left WWE in 2010 to pursue acting, which is also very successful in currently. But again, even despite not having as much as the same success as John Cena, and again, not a slight to Batista, and I know there are some fans that prefer Batista over John Cena, but my opinion, I prefer both, but a slight edge to Cena. I still think Batista still remains a pivotal piece to this significant draft. And honestly, at the time when this happened, I'd say both of them are significant pieces, just in different ways. So before we wrap up, there's some other key figures in this draft, and a lot of them are ones that didn't even get drafted. Like Randy Orton, for example. I mean, he technically did get drafted, but still. Randy Orton, him moving over to SmackDown was a career saver, in my opinion, because if he had stayed on Raw, he was just going to get lost in the shuffle and just be in the shadow of Triple H and Ric Flair for however long it was going to be. But by moving him over to SmackDown and continue to feud with The Undertaker, he was fully tapped into being a heel again and evolve his Legend Killer gimmick, and arguably the best feud of 2005 against the Dead Man. And that further elevated his career to new heights, and he was eventually back into the world title scene. And then you have Chris Jericho. Even though he wasn't drafted and he stayed on Raw, he was that pivotal first piece in making sure Cena was legitimized as the top face on Raw. He succeeded. He did such. But this was also the first feud for Cena where fans really were turning against him in favor of cheering Chris Jericho, unfortunately. And this was Jericho's final WWE feud in his first run before he left, because he wanted to take a break, and he was going on tour with Fozzy, his band. Kurt Angle, him moving to Raw, it started off weird with a SummerSlam feud with Eugene, but then he was right back to being a main event piece, and the second piece in legitimizing Cena for the rest of the year, before he moved over to SmackDown in wake of Batista's injury to win the World Heavyweight title. Then you have JBL, who also wasn't drafted, but he was also a key piece in legitimizing Batista on the blue brand as that new face of SmackDown. So, again, you had JBL winning the SmackDown Championship, but he technically didn't because Batista was there now as the World Heavyweight Champion. So, he, by default, was the number one contender. So, while it was a little more difficult to get Cena over because, well, fans on Raw were preferred to cheer the likes of Jericho and Kurt Angle, it was, I'd say, simpler and kind of easier for Batista to get cheered over the likes of JBL. I feel like it was a lot easier that way. Then you have Rob Van Dam. Once he returned at the 2006 Royal Rumble, he went on to have probably the best success of his WWE run, winning the Money in the Bank in 2006 at WrestleMania 22, and he had a pretty memorable cash-in 2 months later at the 2006 ECW One Night Stand to win the WWE title against, well, a certain someone that you can't see. And then we had probably the best instance of brand warfare that a lot of people for some reason want to bring back at a certain Petco Park in San Diego. I mean, if modern wrestling fans ever want to bring up brand warfare up again, then they in the WWE, they got to do it right, because I'd say, I mean, you can argue that 2002, 2004, and probably I'd say 2005 was when they actually respected. Well, I take that back. 2002 to 2006 was when the WWE actually respected the brand split. But I'd say, in my opinion, 2005 was the best case example of brand warfare done absolutely right. Although 2002 is right up there when it came to the initial start of the brand split. Although it was mainly about setting the tone for both Raw and SmackDown being their own separate shows. But in 2005, it was, making sure that Raw and SmackDown really hated each other. Because even though 2005 was, starting to go a little down, but they still were putting together really good, if not strong, shows post-draft. And that came to a head on Raw's return episode to USA Network in October. And that started with General Manager Eric Bischoff cutting off a match that Vince McMahon had scheduled between SmackDown wrestlers. And in retaliation, SmackDown General Manager Teddy Long ended that episode of Raw, leading a brigade of SmackDown wrestlers to attack the champion John Cena and Kurt Angle before Raw wrestlers brawled with the SmackDown guys to end the show. So that ending to that Raw homecoming set the stage for arguably WWE's best case of brand warfare, leading up to one of the best Survivor Series in its show history. And that showcased the hatred for both brands for each other, because you had Raw and SmackDown wrestlers invading each other's shows. You had multiple pretty intense brawls, like Batista getting chokeslammed on a car windshield and through the announce table by Big Show and Kane on a frequent basis. And you even had Eric Bischoff and Teddy Long in a sanctioned match at Survivor Series. Like, that's when they took the brand split very seriously. Now, again, 2002, you can make a very good case of the brand split, brand warfare done right. Because you had Eric Bischoff and Stephanie McMahon going at each other's throats. And I mean, there was an instance where they literally were. In trying to sign wrestlers to their specific shows. But when it came to actual execution and actual hatred for one another, 2005 checked all the marks on how to do it right. So now to actually wrap it up. I know I went on a long tangent there. So overall, the 2004, a year prior, when the WWE brought back the draft, it was a dud. because not many moves lived up to the billing that Vince McMahon had of a new WWE. Because 2004 was more of a transitional year because Vince had lost The Rock, Vince had lost Stone Cold, Brock Lesnar, and Goldberg. Like 4 key main event players that the WWE had at the time. And Vince not yet had his new cornerstones that he could fully rely on to carry the company. Well, fast forward a year later, Vince is willing to shake things up. This time, matched his actions because of all the significant risks Vince was willing to take, and for the most part, paid off. As the WWE, as we knew at the time, completely changed. And I'd say several years later, it still continues to change because with that biggest switch to move John Cena to Raw and Batista to Smackdown. And like I said, in doing so, both of their careers skyrocketed in different yet kind of similar ways. And to paraphrase what I said earlier, in similar ways, because, well, even though Batista wasn't seen as that 1B later on to John Cena as 1A, they went on to have very successful careers. And they were kind of rivals to one another, like both figuratively and literally, including against each other in 2010. But they still went on to have very, very good success, including in Hollywood these days. And don't forget Randy Orton. He regained his main event level status by going to SmackDown and having that great feud with The Undertaker, and ascended to greater levels from there. So overall, when you look at this 2005 draft lottery, it'll always be remembered as the one that forever changed the game for the modern WWE, even 20 years later. No WWE draft since then has been able to top this one, let alone even with the lack of hype, leading up to it, it still generated a lot of buzz when it first started and to the very end. From start to finish, this draft lottery was the best one that WWE produced. No question. So, yeah. When you look back at this WWE draft, do you think it was good? As I mentioned it, do you think that these big moves changed the landscape of WWE as we know it? And do you think it was for good? Hell, do you even think it was bad? Let me know in the comments below as we reflect back on the 20th anniversary of this 2005 WWE Draft Lottery, which actually turns 20 next month. But we wanted to celebrate it right now. But anyway, let's have a discussion about this WWE Draft Lottery in 2005, whether it's in the comments on YouTube or send me a message on my socials in a DM, however you want to do it. But anyway, that's going to do it for this episode of Very Cold Lasagna. I'm your filthy casual host, Dylan Lasagna, wrapping up this episode number 270 of this icy yet spicy podcast. And as always, keep that lasagna very cold in the fridge with your takes on the world of sports. And until I see ya, when I see you in the next one, peace out.